So we're going to move into chapter 25, which is on the urinary system. And we did this one in lab last week. So we're going to go through a lot of the anatomy of the kidneys. We're going to talk about nephrons and the structure of nephrons. Again, I gave you a real quick overview of that in lab last week. And then we'll go through kidney physiology, which I think that kidney physiology, it's these three things that I have listed up here. I don't think it's super difficult. So I think most people do okay with kidney physiology. So, if you think about just the function of your kidneys overall, their job is to filter waste from your blood, right? Your GI tract is getting rid of solid waste, food waste. Your kidneys are getting rid of blood waste. So where is the waste in your blood coming from? It's just from normal metabolism. So as reactions happen in your body, some of the products that are released are wastes, and you've got to get rid of those. So that's the job of your kidneys. So your kidneys do a ton of things, though. They don't just remove blood waste. They do things like they regulate your water volume. You already know this, right? So this weekend, our sewer pipe sheared off from our house on the outside. So they were there fixing it yesterday, and I was like, nobody use the bathroom. But the second I tell everybody in the house, don't use the bathroom, guess what? I have to use the bathroom. So then I tell my son, I'm like, listen, if it's yellow, let it mellow. Just don't flush, you just let it sit. And even if you poop, if it's brown, don't flush it down. We got to leave it in the toilet because we don't want these poor men working to get a whole bunch of poopy water on them. So we couldn't flush any toilets, we couldn't do any of that kind of stuff. But if you think about water volume, right? When you drink a lot, pee a lot. When you're dehydrated and you haven't been drinking, you don't pee a lot. So yesterday, I truly was like, I'm not going to drink any water. I'm not going to drink because then I'm just going to have to pee, and then it's just going to sit in the toilet. So I won't pee a lot today. And I didn't drink a lot, so I didn't pee a lot because my kidneys were regulating my water volume. They also help to regulate the amount of ions that you have in your extracellular fluid. That's what ECF stands for. This is basically tissue fluid. So how many ions you have that are floating in your tissues that help with reactions. They help with muscle contractions and neurophysiology. Your kidneys help to regulate that. Like how many calcium ions do you have available? Potassium, sodium. They also ensure acid-base balance, which again, I mentioned to you that this is the next chapter. Chapter 27 is all on acid-base balance, but we're going to touch on it in this chapter as well. They remove, like I mentioned earlier, metabolic waste. So all the reactions that happen in your body, some of the byproducts of that are just waste that you need to get rid of. Nitrogenous wastes especially, so your kidneys get rid of that. They get rid of toxins that you might have ingested. Even drugs, those come out in your urine. This is why when people have to do a drug test for work, usually the first thing they'd have to do is pee in a cup. Pee in a cup because it's going to come out in your urine. Also, endocrine functions. Now, we talked about the endocrine system back in AP1, right? And we talked about how this is hormones that are being released. So we talked about hormones like renin. Renin helps to regulate your blood pressure. We also talked about a hormone this semester like erythropoietin. Erythropoietin, or EPO, this one helps to regulate red blood cell production. These both come from the kidneys. So the kidneys do play a role in endocrine or hormone production. Kidneys also help to activate vitamin D. And when you are fasting, your kidneys have the ability to create glucose. They go through a process called gluconeogenesis, which literally, gluco is glucose. What does neo mean? Yeah, like neonatal, right? New. And what does genesis mean? Yeah, beginning. So it literally means the beginning of glucose formation. Your kidneys can do this. So they perform a lot of functions. They're not just regulating water balance. They're getting rid of toxins, they're activating vitamin D, they're releasing hormones, so many different things. So we're going to walk through all the organs of the urinary system in this chapter. So basically it starts with the kidneys. Your kidneys are sort of bean-shaped structures, but they're pretty large. They sit on the posterior abdominal cavity, so they're towards the back of your body. And they are going to be filtering your blood, getting rid of waste, excess water, things like that. they take that urine that they formed and send it down ureters, tubes, into the bladder, which is just a storage tank for the urine. And once your bladder gets full enough, it's going to trigger the need to urinate, and urine's going to come out through the urethra. And that's the tube that carries the urine out of the body. So in this picture, you can see the two kidneys here, which contain nephrons that are doing the filtering of the blood, creating that urine, which is going to drain down the ureters into the bladder. And when the bladder is full, you void the bladder through the urethra. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the kidneys. The right kidney is crowded a little bit by the liver. So if we think about, if we look at this, I have a picture, not really, but we can see over here on this model. Right, if you look at the torso model, you can see how the liver kind of sits. If you think about the rat, remember the liver is more on the right side. It kind of sits a little lower over here on the right side. So the right kidney sits a little lower in the body. Okay. The left kidney is a little higher. You do have an adrenal gland that sits right on top of both kidneys. And going into and out of the kidney, you have ureters, you have blood vessels, you have lymphatic vessels, and then you also have nerves. All of these go into and out of the kidney at this place in the kidney that looks like a little indent. We call that the renal hilum. So this is a good picture. It's showing from the back, a posterior view. Now you can really see that right kidney sits lower than the left kidney. Now if we look at the kidney, you do have some tissues that surround the kidney. You have something called renal fascia. This is the layer of connective tissue that anchors your kidney and the adrenal glands to the surrounding structures. And then you also have this perirenal fat capsule. Right? Peri means around. So this is a fat capsule that goes around the kidney. It's just a cushion. And so really what this is doing is it's helping to cushion and protect the kidney. It also helps to give it some energy so that it can continue to filter. But if, for whatever reason, maybe you have dropped tremendous, maybe you're starving. Normally when you are dieting, you lose subcutaneous fat. You don't lose visceral fat, organ fat. But if someone is starving and their body has basically eaten all of their own fat tissue, it does start to consume visceral fat. That includes things like the greater omentum and the fat that's in this perirenal fat capsule. So if that fat dwindles, what happens is the kidneys will start to drop. They'll sag a little bit, and it causes the ureter oftentimes to get kinked. If the ureter gets kinked, you can't drain urine out of the kidney. So the kidney swells up, gets bigger. We call that hydronephrosis. Literally, it means water on the kidney. The kidney just looks really swollen, and it can damage your kidneys. It makes them not function anymore. So it can eventually lead to renal failure. And then lastly, we also have this fibrous capsule, which is a really tough fibrous capsule made of fibrous connective tissue. And its job is to contain the kidney and keep any infection in the kidneys from spreading out into the abdominal cavity. So it's really easy for people to get like UTIs, urinary tract infections. Usually urinary tract infections form in the bladder. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. But if it's left untreated, it can very quickly spread up the ureters and into the kidneys as well, and you can get a kidney infection. We have this nice fibrous capsule keeping the infection in the kidney, not spreading to other organs. So if we look at this picture, I'm going to draw just in black around this very outside. Okay, and you can see that on both sides. So way around the outside, we have this renal fascia. Just under that, we have that fat capsule, which you can see up here, it's in yellow. Right, so you can see the fat here. And then directly on top of the kidney is that fibrous capsule. So it sits right on top of the kidney. Some of you, when you dissected the kidney, when you did that frontal cut, you may have seen that fibrous capsule, you can probably see that little film on top of the kidney. Now, if we look at the kidney itself, there's different regions to the kidney. The outermost part is called the cortex, so the renal cortex. Just with under that, you have the renal medulla. I always remember medulla for middle. This is usually kind of a pinkish color. It's darker in that renal medulla. And in the renal medulla, you have these renal pyramids they look like little triangles separated by these columns, renal columns. And then you also have deep inside the kidney the renal pelvis. This is where the urine is going to funnel into. It's moving through the minor and the major calyces. So let's go through some pictures here. So on the left, you can see a preserved specimen, and on the right, it's just the drawing. So we're going to use the one on the right. So you can see the cortex. I'll just write cortex out here. It's a lighter in color. And then you can see the medulla has all these renal pyramids. Makes sense why they're named that. They look like little triangles, right? And in between renal pyramids, you have these renal columns. Right? In between all those pyramids are the renal columns. And at the papillae of the pyramid, the tip of that pyramid, remember, spanning through this renal pyramid, you have nephrons that are filtering your blood, creating urine. And the urine is going to move down, and it's going to come out here into this renal pelvis eventually. And remember how it moves? It moves through the minor calyx, then into the major calyx, which is where you have several of these minors coming together, and then into the renal pyramid, or renal pelvis. Okay, so it kind of funnels that way. So through the minor, I'll write minor on here, and then major, and then pelvis, where they all come together. And then eventually it's going to come out through the ureter. Okay. So this is just showing you kind of the flow of urine, what we just talked about. So urine is created by the nephrons, which are found in the renal pyramids. So you start in one of these renal pyramids. Okay. From there it moves through the minor calyx, then the major calyx, then the renal pelvis, and out the ureter. Now there are a couple of imbalances that can affect the kidneys. One is called pyelitis. Pyelitis is when you get an infection up in the renal pelvis and in the major and minor calyces. Pyelonephritis is when that infection gets into the entire kidney. So it's not just in the space right there, it actually moves up into those nephrons, and it actually causes the kidney to swell and fill with pus. Normally this is successfully treated with antibiotics. And what actually causes both of these is urinary tract infections that spread up into the kidneys. It is much more common for women to get urinary tract infections more often than men. Does anybody know why? Why is it easier for a woman to get a urinary tract infection?
You know, why
Yeah, so that's one reason. One reason is because when we urinate, we wipe, right? And if you wipe from back to front, you can get some bacteria from the anal region up into the urethra. So that's one reason. Did you say another one, Demetria?
That's what you said.
Same thing. Really, but it's much more common for women because of our anatomy, right? Our urethra is really short. Our urethra is only like an inch or an inch and a half long. It's really, really short before it gets into our bladder. The male urethra, this is what most guys would say, is really long, right? No, the male urethra is much longer. It can be like 5 inches, 6 inches. And the reason for that is because it has to go through the penis, through that genitalia. And so, women, through wiping the wrong way, or even through intercourse can actually push bacteria up the urethra, and it starts in the bladder, and then it can very easily spread up into the kidneys. So I used to have a friend who would tell me all the time, oh, I always get urinary tract infections. And so I told her, I'm like, are you going to the bathroom after intercourse? She was like, no. I said, you need to void your bladder after intercourse. It's really important for women to do that because when you void your bladder right after sex, you push the bacteria back out. If you don't go to the bathroom, it's just going to sit in there and it can very easily spread up into that bladder. Okay. So, I mentioned already that, one of the huge functions of your kidneys is to clean your blood. So you have some arteries, renal arteries, that deliver about 1/4 of your cardiac output to your kidneys every minute. So that means your entire blood volume is completely cleaned in 4 minutes. So every 4 minutes, you have completely turned over and cleaned out your blood volume. So now I want you to think about somebody who is in renal failure, whose kidneys aren't functioning, right? This is a huge deal. So this is why people who are in renal failure have to go in for dialysis. Dialysis means they pull blood out of their body, send it through a machine to clean it, and then they put the blood back into their body, right? So this machine is taking the place of their kidneys. How often do dialysis patients get dialysis? Does anybody know? How many? Yeah, now it depends on how bad their renal failure is, but yeah, it can be 3, sometimes even 4 times a week, right? That is not a very good replacement for the kidneys. Kidneys are replacing your entire blood volume and cleaning it in 4 minutes. So someone on dialysis is only going in 3 days a week to have their blood cleaned, right? Now, blood flow going into your kidneys and out of the kidneys follows very similar pathways. Now, I very quickly went over the blood vessels going into the kidneys, right? So we're going to do that again in the lecture, and we'll use this picture. But one thing before we go through it, I want to show you is if you look at the artery and the veins, right? The artery in this case is red. The arteries are bringing the blood into the kidney. And remember, I told you in the lab that the whole point is to try to get the blood out to the cortex where the nephrons start, so they can start cleaning the blood. And then that clean blood is going to come back the same way. And you can kind of see from this image, you can see that the arteries and the veins follow very similar pathways. If you see an artery, you're going to see a vein right next to it. Okay, so we're going to take the dirty blood all the way into the cortex where the nephrons are. We're going to clean it. We're going to drain that clean blood back out of the kidney. Okay, following pretty much the same path. So this is the words so that you know the names of all of these vessels. So we're going to start at the aorta. Y'all should know where the aorta is, right? Remember, you have that big aorta coming off your heart. You have a descending aorta, an abdominal aorta. Branching off of the aorta, right off the abdominal aorta, you have the renal artery. That's going to bring that dirty blood. I'll write dirty next to it so you remember. It's going to bring that dirty blood into the kidney. Once it gets into the kidney, it branches into the segmental artery. Then it's going to branch and go in between those renal pyramids through what's called the interlobar artery. Then it kind of comes around the end of the pyramid through the arcuate artery, and then it radiates out through the cortex. That's the cortical radiate artery, right? Now, this part down here that I have a dashed line around, I put a dashed line around this part, or there is a dashed line around this part, because it's trying to show you that this is the nephron. So these are the vessels that are in the nephron. So once that cortical radiate artery goes out through the cortex, blood is going to move into the nephron, and it's coming through what's called an afferent arteriole. Remember, afferent means approach. So it's approaching the nephron. It's coming into the nephron. Then it moves through the glomerulus. Now remember in lab, the glomerulus is that big ball of capillaries in the nephron. Okay. We clean the blood there. So this is where it gets cleaned. So all right, blood gets cleaned. Now we got to drain it. We got to get it out, back out of the nephron and out of the kidney. So it's going to move through the efferent arteriole. So remember E for exit. Then from there, it's going to move through what are called the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. This is pretty much the only one that doesn't really match. You don't have peritubular capillaries or vasa recta coming into the nephron. So this is the only one where you don't have them matching. Okay. And then from there, they go back out through the cortical radiate, through the arcuate, the interlobar, back out through the renal vein. Okay, so they follow the same path in and out. There's just that one extra. So I'm going to go back to this picture, and let's look at these on the picture. Okay, so blood that's dirty is coming in through this renal artery, the red one. Okay, as soon as it branches, once it gets into the hilum, it's branching, and we call those the segmental arteries. From there, it's going to move in between the renal pyramids. We call those the interlobar arteries. Then it moves kind of around the outside edge of the pyramid. Those are called the arcuate. And then it's going to radiate out through the cortex. Those are our cortical radiate. And that's when it gets into the nephron and gets cleaned. Right? And then again, it's going to come back out the same way. Okay? So I want to walk you through the nephrons. Let's talk about the part of the kidney that's cleaning that blood. You have about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. And there's kind of two parts to a nephron. There's the corpuscle and the tubule. Okay, those are the two parts. So we're going to start with the corpuscle. The corpuscle is, if we look at this picture, it's kind of a weird picture, but here's the arcuate artery. Here's the cortical radiate artery. And here you can see that big ball of capillaries. That's our glomerulus, right? So everything that's in yellow is the nephron, right? This is where we're going to collect all the waste and form urine. So the renal corpuscle is just this part right here. It's basically the little cup that's going to collect the waste. So here's the renal corpuscle. So the two parts of the corpuscle include the glomerulus, which is that big ball of capillaries in there. You can kind of see it through there. And so we say the glomerulus is capillaries, but remember back in chapter 17, we talked about how we have different kinds of capillaries. We have continuous capillaries. We have fenestrated capillaries. And so the glomerulus is fenestrated capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries are the ones that have all the little holes in them. So this is going to allow us to pull waste out. Okay, we're going to pull waste out of the bloodstream, out of the capillaries, and form that filtrate. Okay, now, the holes are too small to let big things pass. We're not going to be pulling out red blood cells or white blood cells. You should not urinate that stuff out. It's only going to be pulling out ions and water. And where that's going to go is into the little cup. That's called the glomerular capsule. I call it the Bowman's capsule. It's kind of the old term for it. It's just how I learned it. So that's usually what I default to. Okay. So again, that's kind of the cup that's going to grab all of the filtrate. And it's going to collect in that cup. The way that I sort of think about this part of the nephron is sort of like you're making coffee. Almost like you've got your coffee filter would be like the glomerulus. You've got coffee in it. And you're going to run water through it, right? And that's going to collect in the Bowman's capsule. Okay, so it's kind of like what's happening. All the rest of the nephron, so all of this stuff here, all the tubes, those are called the renal tubules. And there's 3 parts. There's the proximal convoluted tubule. That should make sense. We talked about this in lab. It's proximal because it's closest to the beginning of the nephron. Convoluted because it's all twisty-curvy. Okay. Then we have this nephron loop. It's a loop because you can see it goes down and back up. And then we have this distal convoluted tubule. So those are kind of the 3 parts to the renal tubule. Do what? Yeah, it does. It kind of looks like one of those fun straws. The collecting duct is over here. And the collecting duct, you can kind of see it looks sort of like a tree trunk where they've cut off all the branches. So all these little parts right here sticking out, these little leftover branches, those are other nephrons that are dumping urine into the collecting duct. That's why we call it the collecting duct. It's collecting urine from lots of nephrons, many nephrons. And all of that urine is going to be collected and dumped down into the minor calyx. So I want to walk you through a little bit about, I told you about the parts of a nephron. So let's talk about, we actually have two kinds of nephrons in our kidneys. One type is called a cortical nephron. These are the main type of nephrons in the kidneys. They make up about 85% of the nephrons. And these get their name because they're almost entirely in the cortex. A little bit dips down into the medulla, but it's mostly in the cortex. The other type is called juxtamedullary. So what does juxta mean? Does anybody know? Like, have you heard, like, yeah, juxtaposition? Yeah. So it kind of means both. It can jump. And so juxtamedullary means it can jump into the medulla. It dips down into the medulla. Okay. So these are really long nephrons. They have long loops, those loops of Henle, that go way down into the medulla. They are super important because they help you concentrate your urine. And we're going to talk about how that happens in a little bit. So here's the two different kinds. So I know that you're not really looking at the whole kidney, right? They've just taken this little part right here between the cortex and the medulla, and you're only looking at the nephrons. But you can tell from this picture, right? Here's the arcuate artery and veins. Those separate the cortex up here from the medulla down here. Okay, so I'm going to write that on here. So you should know that if you see the arcuate arteries and veins, you know everything above it is cortex, and everything below it is medulla because of where they're found, right? If we go back to this picture, these are the vessels that are right here. So you can tell they're just separating cortex from medulla. Okay, so the one on the left over here, this is a cortical nephron, and you can see that you've got the glomerulus, you've got the proximal convoluted tubule, you've got this loop of Henle, you've got the distal convoluted tubule. So you can see the loop of Henle, most of the entire nephron is in the cortex. It might dip a little bit into the medulla, but that's it. Whereas this one over here, this is our juxtamedullary nephron, and it looks very different. You can see that the glomerulus, the Bowman's capsule, proximal tube are all in the cortex, but when you get into this loop of Henle, you can see it dips way down into the medulla. Okay, that's juxtamedullary. So the other thing I want to walk you through, if we look at this picture, surrounding our nephrons, all this stuff that's in purple, these are vessels. These are blood vessels. So I want to talk to you a little bit about these blood vessels. There's actually two capillary beds that are associated with our nephrons. Whether we're looking at a cortical nephron or a juxtamedullary, they both have a glomerulus. So all nephrons have a glomerulus. But peritubular capillaries, this is the other kind of capillary bed. These are only found in cortical nephrons. And the vasa recta is a capillary bed only found in juxtamedullary nephrons. So this is why I say up here that the renal tubules are associated with two capillary beds. They all have a glomerulus. If it's a cortical nephron, it has peritubular capillaries. If it's a juxtamedullary nephron, it has a vasa recta. Okay. Peritubular capillaries, these have a really low pressure. They're really porous. And they're really great at absorbing water and solutes. The vasa recta, here, let me go back to this picture so I can show you. Here are the peritubular capillaries. Right. And these are mostly found in the cortex. The vasa recta, which we only find on these juxtamedullary nephrons, are found in that loop of Henle. they are super important at concentrating the urine. And that's the whole point of juxtamedullary nephrons anyway, is to concentrate the urine. So I'm going to walk you through some of these capillary beds. Since the whole role of your kidneys and your nephrons is to filter blood, the capillary beds are really important, right? So the first one all nephrons have is the glomerulus. The glomerulus' job is filtration, right? That's what it does. It helps to filter. And so one thing that makes the glomerulus very different, if you think about capillary beds, we talked about these when we did blood vessels, right? And we talked about things like net filtration pressure. How when you look at a normal capillary bed, right, this is my capillary bed, I have an arteriole that feeds it, right? And what drains it? Venule. Right? So that's normal capillary beds. Glomerulus is different because it is fed by an arteriole and drained by an arteriole. There is no venule in a glomerulus. So you can see there's an afferent arteriole. I remember A for approach. There's the glomerulus, and what's draining the glomerulus, which is a capillary bed, is an efferent arteriole. I remember E for exit. Now the blood pressure in the glomerulus is actually really high. It's higher than just a normal blood pressure. And the reason for that is blood kind of backs up in the glomerulus. So what happens is you actually have afferent arterioles that have a bigger diameter than the efferent arterioles. So you're actually pumping more blood into the glomerulus than you're draining back out. And because of that, the blood kind of pools in there and it creates a higher pressure. We need this pressure because this is what helps us filter out the waste. It's needed for filtration. This process produces a ton of fluid. So we pump the blood into the glomerulus. It kind of pools and creates this high pressure, so we force a lot of stuff out into the Bowman's capsule, and then we drain the blood, right? And we produce a lot of fluid in this process. 99% of that fluid ends up getting reabsorbed and put back in your bloodstream, okay? So this is a good image. This one, it's a little weird, but you can see over here on the left, they're trying to show you the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. This is kind of what you looked at in lab. So you can see the glomerulus, you can see this Bowman's capsule around it. But in this case, you can see the afferent arteriole, bringing the blood in, is fatter than the efferent arteriole draining the blood. So that's why there is a high pressure in here. That high pressure is going to force wastes and all kinds of things, fluid, out of the capillaries and into the Bowman's capsule. I told you that this produces a lot of fluid. It produces 180 liters of filtrate. Do you urinate out 180 liters a day? Think about a 2-liter bottle of Coke. That would be urinating 90 of those. Do you urinate 92 liters? No. We would never leave the bath. Well, you might. You probably feel like it, don't you? You don't urinate out 92 liters, right? That would be horrific. You'd never leave the bathroom. And you'd be super dehydrated. So I told you 99% of this gets reabsorbed. And so we only produce somewhere between 1 to 1.5 liters of urine a day. Okay? So we're reabsorbing a ton of this fluid. So when we look at the physiological formation of urine, there's 3 physiological aspects. One is called glomerular filtration, which we've just talked about a little bit. This is going to produce the filtrate. This will make 180 liters of filtrate. That is way more than we need. So I told you that we end up having to put a lot of it back in our bloodstream. That's what this next step is. The next step is called tubular reabsorption. We reabsorb a ton of that fluid and put it back in the bloodstream. So 99% of the substances that get pulled out in glomerular filtration go back to your blood. And then the last step, called tubular secretion, this is kind of your second chance to remove any waste that you didn't get the first time up here in glomerular filtration. Just kind of a second pass. Let's pull out anything we might not have gotten the first time. That is it. That, in a nutshell, is renal physiology. You pull a bunch of stuff out of your blood. A lot of it is good stuff. You put all the good stuff back in and you're left with the waste. Then you get a second chance to pull out waste from your blood. Okay? And so those are our 3 steps. This is a picture from your book. I like this picture because it makes it really simple. So this is trying to show you a nephron along with all the vessels. So you can see the cortical radiate artery. You can see the afferent arteriole. Here's our glomerulus. The efferent arteriole. Then you can see the whole nephron. It's trying to show you the Bowman's capsule. And then it's trying to show you all of the tubules. Okay? So it's showing you all 3 steps. The one that's in red at the very top, that's glomerular filtration. I'll circle it down here. Glomerular filtration. We're going to pull out a lot of stuff from the blood. A lot of waste, but also a lot of good stuff, a lot of fluid. The second step is let's put all that good stuff back in our bloodstream. You can see that happening right here. We're going to take it from the tubes of the nephron and put it back into our bloodstream. That's called tubular reabsorption. And then the last step is if there's any waste we didn't get on the first pass during glomerular filtration, we can pull it out. We have one more chance to pull it out. So you can see we're pulling from the bloodstream, putting it into the nephron, and that's tubular secretion. So your kidneys will filter your entire plasma volume about 60 times a day. So that's a lot. And again, they're producing urine from the filtrate. And basically, what is being produced is your blood plasma minus all the proteins. You don't pull proteins out. You don't pull red blood cells out. You don't pull white blood cells out. So it's basically like plasma, but none of the big plasma proteins. That's what's getting pulled out. And any metabolic wastes and substances your body doesn't need. Like, for example, excess vitamins, right? Like water-soluble vitamins. Whatever your body doesn't use in an hour or 2, you're going to urinate out. Your kidneys are going to filter it. You pee it right back out. So we're going to go through each of those 3 steps of urine formation, right? We're going to start with glomerular filtration. So one thing that I want to tell you about this step is that it's a passive process. What does that mean? Yeah, it doesn't need any energy. So no energy is required for glomerular filtration. So how are you pulling out water and all the wastes? You're doing it through pressure. So remember, I just showed you the glomerulus and how the afferent arteriole is really fat and the efferent is skinny. I told you that the pressure builds up in there. So it's just straight up pressure. It's forcing the fluid and the wastes out. So it's a passive process. So it happens through hydrostatic pressure, which is basically blood pressure. And you have this porous membrane in the glomerulus that's allowing water, solutes, any solute that's smaller than a plasma protein, but no cells. You might, somebody might have white blood cells in their urine when they do a urine test. If you have white blood cells in your urine, you have a urinary tract infection, right? Your immune system's trying to fight it off. That's why there would be white blood cells in there. You also should not have any red blood cells in your urine. If you have red blood cells in your urine, you may have like a kidney stone. You may have something that has scraped the ureter or something that has damaged the kidney, right? And you're getting some bleeding into that area. But otherwise, you should have no cells coming out in your urine, okay? Now, there's 3 layers in the glomerulus. There's this fenestrated endothelium. That is the lining of the capillaries. It's fenestrated, it has little holes in it. We've talked about that back in chapter 17. It allows molecules to pass. But you also have a basement membrane, and you have something called foot processes of podocytes. These just help to trap bigger molecules like carbohydrates and proteins and anything that's big. Doesn't let that through. So I'll show you a picture. You can see over here the glomerulus, and they've just blown a section of it up and made it really big. So here's the glomerulus. Here is the fenestrated endothelium. So you can see the little holes. This is how we're going to pull things out of your blood. Wastes, all kinds of stuff. But then you can also see there's a basement membrane, and you can see these foot processes of podocytes. Here's a podocyte. It's a cell that kind of wraps around that capillary, and it creates, I don't know, it reminds me of like a colander, right? Like that you cook with when you boil your spaghetti noodles, you dump them and you let all the water come out. That's kind of what this reminds me of. It creates like a sieve or a colander, so that if something big makes it through these fenestrations, you have these foot processes of the podocytes to trap it. So it's not actually getting pulled into the rest of the nephron. Okay. This is what it actually looks like on your kidneys. So this is a scanning electron micrograph. If we go back, this image made it look like those foot processes were kind of spread apart. You can see that this is a great sieve, right? They are tightly linked in there, so things that are big aren't passing through. Any molecule that gets stuck in those foot processes, we call those filtration slits. If I go back to this picture, you can see all the slits in here. So any molecule that gets stuck in those slits ends up getting engulfed by some mesangial cells. Molecules that are smaller than about 3 nanometers are able to pass, so this includes things like water, glucose, amino acids, and nitrogenous wastes. All of those can pass into the Bowman's capsule. Plasma proteins are big. Blood proteins are big. They don't pass through there. Plasma proteins, we don't want them to pass through there because they actually maintain an osmotic pressure. And so if you pass plasma proteins through, your water balance would be way off. So we don't pass those through. If there are proteins or blood in your urine, there's a problem. Like I mentioned, if you have blood in your urine, it could mean that you've passed a kidney stone and it scraped your ureter on the way down. You're bleeding a little bit. But if you have no issues and you have blood in your urine, it could mean that there's a problem with the membrane of the glomerulus, right? You're getting blood cells passing through, big things passing through. Same thing with proteins. When I go to my doctor every year, they always do a urine test. And so for like 3 years in a row, I had a very small amount of protein in my urine. And so the doctor was like, you shouldn't have any protein in your urine. So that's when I had to take home the huge jug and do like that 3-day urine collection. Has anyone ever had to do that? It's terrible because you have to collect every time you pee. You have to collect it and keep it and put it in a jug, which goes in your refrigerator. It's the weirdest thing.
Something that you put on ice.
Yes. Yes.
I had to do that for the patients.
You had to save their urine. Yeah. Another thing that we've mentioned about this semester is we've talked a little bit about blood pressure, right? We talked about your blood pressure. It's 120/80. And how we don't want pressure to be too high. We also don't want it to be too low. Too high of a pressure can be really bad because it really can affect these tiny capillary beds, including the ones in the kidneys. When your pressure is really high, that means that the pressure all over the body, including these capillary beds, is elevated. And these capillaries are really thin, and it causes them to not work the way they should. You might be pulling way more things out because of it. You might blow the capillaries if your pressure gets too high. Same thing if your pressure is too low. Low pressure, that's not too bad, but just a little lower than normal is actually good. You might have cold hands and feet. But if your pressure gets really low, what's going to happen is you don't have a high enough pressure for your kidneys to filter your blood anymore. And so usually what happens, this would be like if somebody's in shock. Somebody's in shock, their pressure tanks, and the first organ that's going to shut down is the kidneys. And then once the kidneys shut down, every organ after that starts shutting down. And that's because the pressure's not high enough to let these processes happen. So there is a condition called anuria. Anytime you see that qualifier A in front of a word, it means not. So it means you are not urinating. Or you have a really low urine output. And this could be because your pressure is very low. Your overall blood pressure is low, so the pressure in the glomerulus is too low to produce filtrate, and it causes the nephrons to stop functioning, and it leads to renal failure, right? So, this first step in renal physiology, this glomerular filtration, Basically, it's forming filtrate. It's making your urine, you're forcing all the stuff, water, glucose, amino acids, all kind of things get pulled out of your blood into the Bowman's capsule, right? Everything but proteins. The pros is it's passive. It requires no energy. The cons are that you pull out everything. Water, glucose. You need glucose to make energy. Amino acids. You're pulling out a lot of good stuff. So this is why we have our second step, tubular reabsorption. We're going to reabsorb all that good stuff and put it back in our bloodstream. Okay? And so that's the second part here. And you can see the arrows are going from the nephron into the bloodstream. So most of the contents that you've pulled out in glomerular filtration, like 99%, get put right back into your bloodstream. All organic nutrients get reabsorbed. This includes glucose, right? How much glucose should you have in your urine? You did this in lab last week. None. You should have no glucose in your urine, right? That's good. We need glucose to make energy. We put it right back in our bloodstream. We don't want to urinate that out. Water, most water gets put back in our bloodstream. Unless you are well hydrated, then you can afford to lose water, but otherwise we put it right back in our bloodstream. Even ions will get reabsorbed. And so there's two routes for this. How we can reabsorb and put back in our bloodstream. We can do it through what's called transcellular, which means it goes right through the cytosol of the cells, or paracellular, which means it just goes between the cells of that tubule. So this is just showing you the two different ways, right? So you can see that water and solutes, I'll do it in a different color. Water and solutes, these are getting pulled right through the cells of the tubule into the bloodstream. Paracellular, we can pull other water and solutes in between the cells. Those are the two ways that we can pull things back to our bloodstream. So I told you it reabsorbs like 99% of what you pulled out in glomerular filtration gets put back in your bloodstream. It ends up being about 60 to 70% of the water you pulled out. It's 99 to 100% of the organic molecules. So again, this includes glucose, amino acids, even vitamins. You're going to put a lot of those back in your bloodstream. And a lot of ions, like sodium and chloride. You know, we are at the end of AP2. And if we think back to all the physiological processes we have talked about between AP1 and AP2, think about the role of sodium in muscle physiology, in neurophysiology, in heart muscle contraction. We use sodium for so many we have to have sodium for a lot of our systems to function. We're not going to pee it out. We're going to put a lot of it right back in our bloodstream. Same thing with chloride. We use these ions for the functioning of a lot of our organ systems. So solute concentration in your filtrate is going to increase as you absorb water. That should make sense to you. If you have a bucket of salt water, right, and you take a lot of the water out and take it out, then you should be left with extra salty water, right? Think of like boiling some water on a stove. If you boil salt water, you boil off all the water, you're left with really concentrated salt water, right? So this is what happens. The solute that you've pulled out, the waste you pulled out, as you go through tubular reabsorption and put water back into your bloodstream, you're concentrating that solute down, okay? Fat-soluble substances, and some ions, urea, these are going to follow water. So during tubular reabsorption, you are putting water back into your bloodstream. You're also going to be putting some fat-soluble substances back in your bloodstream, ions, and even urea, which is a waste. It follows water. We put it right back in our bloodstream, right? This is why we talked about fat-soluble vitamins and how you don't want to get too many of those because your body can't get rid of them because they follow water. Even though you might try to urinate them out, when you get into tubular reabsorption, whoop, they go right back in your bloodstream, okay? This is why fat-soluble vitamins, lipid-soluble drugs, environmental pollutants, a lot of environmental pollutants are also lipid-soluble. It's really hard to get rid of these. So I used to do field work when I was at Ohio State. I did field work at a place called Gibraltar Island. And one of the things that we noticed, it was up in Lake Erie, one of the things that they noticed in Lake Erie, there was an introduced species into the lake. It's called the zebra mussel. Y'all know what the zebra mussel is? The zebra mussel is this little tiny mussel that was brought in by ships, and it's amazing at filter feeding. So it would filter feed. And one of the amazing things that the zebra mussel did is that it really cleaned up Lake Erie. I don't know if y'all know this, because I know you probably don't pay attention to any states up there in the north. But Lake Erie is known for, there was one of the tributaries coming off that lake that caught on fire. No joke. The lake caught on fire. That's how polluted it was. So the zebra mussel ended up accidentally getting introduced to the lake, and it filter fed, and it truly cleaned up the lake. The lake ended up being sparkling clean. Problem is, the zebra mussels reproduce very quickly, and so they ended up you could not walk out into the lake because they would cut your feet, so you had to wear shoes like Tevas or Chacos. They biofouled all the effluent pipes that were going out into the lake from industry, so they would block these pipes. It was pretty nasty. But one of the things they noticed, another big issue, is because they would filter feed through the lake and they cleaned it up, they also accumulated all the toxins in the lake. And you got to think about mussels. What eats mussels? Like, what in the lake would eat mussels? Fish. So one of the things they would tell you, if you live by Lake Erie, they would say you cannot have more than 2 fish a month that come out of Lake Erie. If you're pregnant, you can't have more than 1. That to me is like, I'm not eating any fish that comes out of this lake, right? So the fish would eat the zebra mussels, and guess what? As they would eat the mussels, all those toxins would accumulate in the fish. And then what eats fish? Well, we do, but birds of prey would eat fish. So like eagles, bald eagles. And we know that those are endangered anyway. And so what ended up happening is all these toxins bioaccumulated up the food chain. And so the bald eagles ended up dropping in numbers in terms of population because all these toxins caused their eggs, when they would have eggs, the shell would be so thin because of the toxins that they could never come to term. So the population numbers went down even further. So this is a huge issue when we talk about drugs and pollutants. If they are lipid soluble, you can't get rid of them. They are stuck in your body. It's really hard. Even your kidneys, that's their job, is to get rid of that stuff. They can't. This is just showing how it's moving through. So again, transcellular or paracellular. So I told you in lab last week when y'all had to urinate in the cup, right? I told you that you should not have any glucose in your urine. Right? And we just talked about how you're going to put all the good stuff back into your bloodstream. You're going to put water, you're going to put glucose back in your bloodstream. But if somebody has like uncontrolled diabetes, then we would see glucose in their urine, right? This is one of the ways that we can test for it. So how this happens is that there are actually some proteins in the renal tubules that will shuttle molecules from the tubule back into your bloodstream during this tubular reabsorption. Especially glucose. But these proteins can get overloaded. They can get saturated when there's excess ions. And if they're overloaded, they can't put it all back in your bloodstream, so some ends up coming out in the urine. This is how someone who is diabetic has glucose in their urine. It's because when you're diabetic, your blood sugar levels are super high. So your kidneys are filtering out in glomerular filtration. You have a ton of sugar in your urine. But during tubular reabsorption, technically we should put it all back in our bloodstream. But we can't if there's that much. If there's that much, you overload these transport proteins. They can't put it all back in, and you end up urinating some of it out. Okay, so that's high blood sugar. We call that hyperglycemia. Okay, hyperglycemia is just you exceed transport proteins and you end up with some glucose in the urine. But we also know that water follows solute. Glucose is a solute. So if you're going to urinate out glucose, you're going to urinate out water. So this is why people who are diabetic urinate a lot. They pee all the time. This is also why they're really thirsty. It's because they're dehydrated from all the urine they're forming. So when we look at where tubular reabsorption is happening, okay, so we know that glomerular filtration happens up here, right? Up in the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. tubular reabsorption is happening in the proximal convoluted tubule, so right here. This is where tubular reabsorption happens. That makes sense, right? We pull out all this good stuff here. We put a lot of good stuff back in your bloodstream right here. Okay. All nutrients like glucose and amino acids, those will get reabsorbed. A lot of sodium and a lot of water, most ions, and even uric acid. Also, tubular reabsorption happens here. It happens in this nephron loop. On the descending limb, so that's the one going down. Here we go. Water can leave. That's it. So you can pull water out and put it into your bloodstream. On the ascending limb, coming up, you can no longer pull water out, but you can pull solutes out and put those in your bloodstream. So it becomes a little more selective when we get into this nephron loop. On the way down, we can put water back in our bloodstream, and on the way up, we can put solutes back in. And then lastly, the other place tubular reabsorption happens is in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. But at this point, by the time you've made it all the way to the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, if you're putting things back in your bloodstream there at the end of the nephron, you're doing it because of hormones. So we say that reabsorption is more hormonally regulated, which means it's much more fine-tuned by the time you get to the end of the nephron. So some examples of some hormones would be like the antidiuretic hormone. What does this one do? Makes you what? Makes you not pee, right? Anti means not. So antidiuretic hormone makes you not pee. So that means that you're going to reabsorb water, put it back in your bloodstream. Aldosterone is one. This is a hormone that helps you reabsorb sodium. But remember, water follows solute. So if you reabsorb sodium, you're going to reabsorb water. So this one is also going to make you not urinate. This one gets released typically when your blood volume or blood pressure are low. That makes sense. Think of a water balloon. If you have not put a lot of water in that water balloon, the blood pressure is really low. There's not a lot of pressure in there. You add more water to it, the pressure goes up. So this is a hormone that gets released. Let's save our water so we can raise our pressure. The atrial natriuretic peptide, this one prevents you from reabsorbing sodium. So this one gets released when your blood pressure's high. It's doing the opposite. It's saying, oh gosh, we don't want more sodium. Let's urinate that out so water can follow and our water volume can drop and our pressure can come back down. So this one gets released when blood pressure's high. And then we also have this parathyroid hormone. Now this is one that we talked about back in AP1. This one gets released when your calcium levels are low. And it helps you reabsorb calcium. In reality, you should not, especially as females, we should not be urinating out calcium. We need it for our bones. And so parathyroid hormone helps to raise our blood calcium levels. Okay, so again, when we talk about reabsorption, it's happening in the proximal tubule. We reabsorb water on the way down, solute on the way up. But by the time we get way over here in the nephron, it's hormonally regulated. So it's much more fine-tuned. What do we need? Do we need to save water? Do we need to save solute? What do we need?